Her name was on a lease. Her name was on a utility account. Her name was on a social media profile she had been building since college. Her name was on a gym membership, a library card, a professional portfolio website that had taken her 3 years to build, and that represented everything she had worked towards since she was 22 years old and standing in her first apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, with a camera and a conviction that she was going to make something real with her life. Her name was everywhere that names appear in the ordinary infrastructure of an ordinary American life. And in the spring of 2017, her name became the most dangerous thing about her, because her husband knew how to search for it. And he had already proven, repeatedly and without consequence, that when he found it, he would come. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of a woman named Melissa, and it begins not with what she did, but with why she had to do it. And by the time this story ends, you will understand that the title of this video is not a provocation. It is not a question. It is a conclusion reached by every person who has ever heard the full account of what Melissa Jean Hartley survived and what she built to survive it. The truth is impossible to condemn, not because what she did was legal, not because what she did was without consequence for other people, but because what she did was the only remaining option available to a woman whose real name had become a location signal for a man who had already proven he would use it to find her. And finding her was not safe. And the research on what happens to women in Melissa's situation when they remain findable is not ambiguous. According to the most recent data from the Centers for Disease Control, more than 50% of women murdered in the United States are killed by a current or former intimate partner. More than 50%. And according to research published in 2026 by public health scientists studying intimate partner homicide, about half of those murders occur as or after a woman tries to leave the relationship or when she is involved in civil, family law proceedings including civil protective orders and divorce. Melissa had a restraining order. Melissa had a divorce filing. Melissa had documentation of 2 restraining order violations in 6 weeks. And Melissa had a name that appeared in enough digital places that a patient and motivated man could find her from a desk in a city she had left. So she stopped having one. Melissa Jean Hartley was born in 1984 in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was the second of 3 children in a household that operated on the particular organized warmth of 2 parents who believed in the structural reliability of honest effort and honest dealing. Her father, Dennis, was an accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing firm in the northern suburbs of the city. Her mother, Carol, taught 2nd grade for 22 years at the same elementary school 3 miles from the house where all 3 Hartley children grew up. The household was not wealthy, but it was stable in a way that stability means more than money. Dinner was at 6. Homework was done before television. And the general operating principle was that if you showed up honestly and worked consistently, the world would generally return those qualities to you in some form. Melissa absorbed this principle the way children absorb the principles of the households they grow up in, completely and without examination, the way you absorb the rules of gravity before you understand physics. It was simply how things worked. It was simply what was true. Her older brother Daniel was steady and precise in the way of first children raised in orderly houses. Her younger sister Laura was bright and slightly chaotic in the way of youngest children who arrive when the household has already established its patterns and who spend their entire childhoods finding the cracks in those patterns to move through. And Melissa was the middle child who had always had a very particular eye for the way light fell on things, not metaphorically, literally. The specific quality of morning light through the kitchen window that turned ordinary objects into something worth studying. The way late afternoon in October made every surface in the neighborhood gold for exactly 40 minutes before the day closed. She noticed these things from childhood, and she was not sure other people noticed them, and she did not ask, because the noticing felt private in a way she could not explain. Her mother kept a drawing Melissa had made at age 7 of the kitchen table at breakfast. It was not the table she had drawn. It was the light on the table. The distinction between the thing and the light on the thing was something Melissa had understood instinctively at 7 years old. That instinct, the instinct for the truth inside the ordinary, would become the most valuable professional gift she possessed. It would also become, in ways she could not have imagined at 7, one of the most important survival tools she would ever use. She studied visual arts at the University of Cincinnati and graduated in 2006 with a portfolio her professors described as demonstrating a genuine and distinctive eye for documentary photography. The specific phrase that appeared in her graduate assessment was this: a photographer who understands that the most important photographs are not of beautiful things, but of the truth inside ordinary ones. She was 22 years old. She was good, and she knew she was good in the quietly certain way that people who were born understanding something know it, not arrogantly, not with performance, just with the settled knowledge of someone who has found the thing they were put here to do and who intends to do it seriously. She moved into a small apartment in the North Side neighborhood of Cincinnati and began building a freelance photography practice with the same patience and precision her work required. By 2008, she had a modest but real client list: documentary commissions, portrait work, occasional editorial assignments for regional publications. She was making enough to sustain herself, and occasionally a little more. She was 24 years old and doing exactly what she had planned to do, and she was happy in the specific way of a person who has not yet encountered the thing that will test whether their happiness is structural or whether it rests on an assumption about the world that will not survive contact with a specific kind of person. She met Nathan Hartley in October 2008 at an art show in the Shortvine Arts District of Cincinnati. He was 31 years old, a commercial real estate developer with enough professional success by his early 30s to buy artwork he genuinely wanted to own rather than artwork that served a social function. He bought one of Melissa's prints that evening, a photograph she had taken in 2007 of a fire escape on a Cincinnati building in early morning light, one of the best things she had made, a photograph that understood exactly the distinction her professors had described. And he came back to her table 3 times before the evening ended, not to buy more, to ask questions. He asked why she had chosen that specific angle for the fire escape photograph. He asked what she had been trying to capture in the quality of the light on the metal. He asked whether she thought the best documentary photographs were the ones that showed the most, or the ones that chose most carefully what to leave out of the frame. That last question was the question. Melissa told her best friend Rachel the following morning that she had met someone who understood the question she had been asking with her work since she was 7 years old, drawing the light on the kitchen table instead of the table. Rachel told her that was either the beginning of something wonderful or the beginning of something to be careful about. Melissa laughed and told her she was being dramatic. She was 24 years old. Rachel was not being dramatic. They married in June 2010. The ceremony was held at a vineyard outside Cincinnati on a warm afternoon in the specific gentle light of early summer that Melissa had always considered the most honest light of the year. 112 guests. Melissa wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a vintage dress she had found in a Columbus shop that needed 3 alterations and was exactly right when they were done. Nathan cried during the vows, not performatively, genuinely, the way a man cries when he is surprised by the depth of what he is feeling, which is the most convincing and the most dangerous kind of crying. Melissa's father, Dennis, told her at the reception that Nathan was a man you could build a life on. He said it with the particular certainty of a man who had spent 30 years assessing reliability in professional contexts and believed he could recognize it in people. He was not wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about how long it would last and what it would cost when it changed. The first 2 years of the marriage were by every account genuine. Nathan was attentive in the specific way he had been at the art show, interested, curious, asking the right questions about her work and actually engaging with the answers. He was proud of her in ways that were visible and specific rather than general and performative. He showed up. He was present. He was the man he had appeared to be at the art show and at the vineyard and across the dinner table in the conversations that had convinced Melissa that Rachel was being dramatic. The first 2 years gave Melissa no information that was inconsistent with what she believed she had chosen. This is important to understand, not because it excuses what came later, but because it explains the particular cruelty of what came later. You cannot be deceived by someone who was always lying to you. You can only be truly and completely deceived by someone who was telling the truth for long enough that the truth became the foundation of your entire understanding of yourself and your life. Nathan was telling the truth for 2 years, and then he stopped. And Melissa did not notice the stopping because the stopping did not announce itself. It arrived as a tone, a temperature, a quality of response that was slightly different from what it had been and that Melissa adjusted to, because adjustment was what you did with the small variations of a long-term relationship and because there was nothing yet to name as wrong. The shift began in 2012. Nathan started finding problems with her photography work. Not specific engaged criticism of the kind that a person who genuinely understood her work might offer problems with a particular composition, a question about a specific choice, rather a general orientation toward the idea that the work she was doing was not quite right, that the clients she was choosing were not the right clients, that the direction she was developing professionally showed a naivety she would eventually regret. The criticism was delivered in the register of concern. He was looking out for her. He was protecting her from professional mistakes that would limit her long-term development. He cared about her work more than she understood because he could see it from outside in ways she could not from inside. Melissa heard the concern and adjusted. And then she adjusted again. And then she noticed that the adjustment had created a new area of concern that also required his input. And then she began to understand, without having words for what she was understanding, that there was no version of her professional choices that would not eventually require his input and would not produce, if she did not seek his input voluntarily, a specific quality of response that had begun to feel more difficult to manage than the criticism itself. The response was not dramatic. It was not shouting. It was a withdrawal, a drop in the temperature of the household that lasted between 2 and 5 days, and that lifted only when Melissa found a way to demonstrate that she had heard Nathan's concern and had taken it seriously and valued his perspective. She did not recognize this as a pattern in 2012. Coercive control has been shown by researchers to be far more psychologically damaging for victims than physical violence alone. Experts describe it as a course of calculated conduct deployed to dominate a partner through intimidation, isolation, and control. Its most insidious quality, the quality that makes it so effective and so difficult to escape, is that it does not present itself as control. It presents itself as love, as concern, as the natural and reasonable investment of a partner who cares about your well-being and wants to protect you from your own mistakes. And by the time a person inside it has accumulated enough information to recognize it as the thing it actually is, they are usually already so deeply inside it that the walls look like wallpaper and the locked door looks like the only door. By 2013, Melissa had begun discussing potential photography clients with Nathan before accepting them. Not because he had told her to, because not doing so had started to produce the temperature drop that she had learned to route around. By 2014, she had stopped taking on certain categories of work entirely, the more adventurous editorial commissions, the documentary projects that would have required travel or extended independent time, because the conversation required to justify them had become more costly than the work was worth. By 2015, she had drifted away from Rachel, not because Nathan had forbidden the friendship, because Rachel had started asking questions during their increasingly infrequent conversations that Melissa could not answer honestly without saying things she had not yet allowed herself to say, and saying them to Rachel would have made them real in a way that Melissa was not yet ready to manage. By 2016, she had not spoken to her sister Laura in 4 months, not because of a specific rupture, because maintaining the version of her life that Laura would not be alarmed by required more energy than she had available after the energy required to navigate Nathan's responses to her ordinary daily existence. She was not isolated by Nathan's demand. She was isolated by her own accumulating management of his responses. She had built the isolation herself, one small reasonable adjustment at a time, without understanding, until much later, that what she had been building was a prison she could not see from inside because she had constructed the walls herself from the inside. In November 2016, the first physical incident occurred. Melissa has spoken about this in a 2024 interview with a domestic violence advocacy publication under a protected name. She has said she is willing to describe what happened in clinical terms, because the clinical terms are the ones that help people recognize patterns rather than the ones that reduce a person's life to a single event. The clinical description is this: Nathan became physically violent once in November 2016 and again in February 2017. Each incident was followed within 48 hours by a period of remorse and attention that researchers who study abuse cycles have described consistently across decades of clinical documentation. Genuine apparent grief from the perpetrator, a return to warmth and attentiveness, a period of relative calm that the victim experiences as both relief and evidence that the situation is not as bad as the incident suggested. And each incident was preceded by a period of escalating tension that Melissa had by that point developed a significant repertoire of strategies to navigate around. None of the strategies worked. The escalation followed its own internal logic regardless of what Melissa did or did not do in response to it. This is the thing that people who have never been inside a cycle of intimate partner violence most consistently fail to understand. The victim's behavior does not cause the escalation. The victim's behavior does not control the escalation. The victim's behavior is simply the variable that the abuser's internal cycle reorganizes around. The cycle belongs to the abuser. The victim is simply the person who has to live inside it. In March 2017, on a Wednesday evening while Nathan was at a work dinner in downtown Cincinnati, Melissa packed 2 suitcases. She took her camera equipment. She took her grandmother's pearl earrings. She took the hard drive that contained her professional archive going back to 2004. She drove to Laura's house. She did not leave a note. She filed for divorce the following Monday with an attorney she had found through a domestic violence legal aid organization she had contacted 6 weeks earlier and never told anyone about. She changed her phone number. She informed her employer. She told Laura and Rachel what had been happening for the previous 5 years, and she sat inside the specific and irreversible grief of watching the 2 people who loved her most absorb 5 years of information she had been protecting them from. Laura cried. Rachel did not cry. Rachel sat very still, and then said the thing that Rachel had always said when she understood something clearly. She said, "Okay, what do we do now?" And Melissa told her what she knew so far, which was that she had left, which was that she had a lawyer, which was that the lawyer had told her the most important thing the lawyer knew to tell someone in Melissa's situation. The most dangerous period of an abusive relationship is not the years inside it. It is the period immediately after separation. About half of murders of women by intimate partners occur as or after a woman tries to leave. The leaving does not end the danger. For many women, the leaving is where the danger begins. Nathan contested the divorce within the week. He did not accept the end of the marriage as a fact. He accepted it as a new phase of a situation he was not finished with. And he engaged the new phase with the same patience and the same attention to detail that he had applied to the previous phase. He called Melissa's employer and described a version of her professional conduct that was internally consistent, plausible, specific, and entirely fabricated. The call did not result in her losing her position, but it required a conversation with her manager that cost Melissa 2 hours and a significant amount of professional credibility she had spent years building. He began appearing at the coffee shop in the North Side neighborhood, where Melissa had gone every Saturday morning since 2009. Not every Saturday. Enough Saturdays. Enough that Melissa stopped going. He sent emails at 2 and 3 in the morning that alternated between declarations of love so specific in their detail that they were almost more frightening than the threats, and accusations so precisely constructed that each individual one could be explained away, but together formed a document of a man who had organized his waking hours around the project of maintaining contact with a person who had filed a legal instrument specifically to prevent that contact. An estimated 70% of domestic violence survivors in 2025 reported being monitored through phones, GPS, or social media accounts. Digital stalking and online harassment are now recognized as extensions of traditional abuse, forcing advocates and lawmakers to redefine what safety means in the digital era. GitHub https github.com Babuse Korea Voice Pro. Nathan was not a digital expert. He was a man with time and motivation and a working knowledge of how much personal information the average American leaves visible across the platforms they use. He created social media accounts under names she did not recognize. She blocked them. He created new ones. She made her profiles private. He requested to follow her under a new account with a borrowed profile photograph and a plausible name, and she accepted the request before she had looked carefully enough at the account to recognize what it was. She changed her email address. He found the new one within 3 weeks through a combination of public professional listings and the particular persistence of someone who has decided that finding a specific person is a project worth sustained effort. She changed her phone number. The emails to the new address continued from the new accounts he kept creating. She moved apartments in September 2017. In October 2017, she found a photograph of the exterior of her new apartment building posted from an account she did not recognize. The photograph was taken from the street. She could identify from the quality of the light in it that it had been taken in early morning. He had found her new address. He had been there before she knew he had found it. The restraining order was issued in September 2017. Nathan violated it the following week. He violated it again 3 weeks after that. Both violations were documented with police reports and submitted to the court with the existing case file. The legal response was a scheduled court appearance and a formal warning. Melissa drove home from the police station after the second violation on a Thursday evening in October 2017, and she sat in her apartment and she did the mathematics that the situation required. She had a restraining order that had been violated twice in 6 weeks, without producing an outcome that changed Nathan's behavior. She had an ex-husband who had demonstrated across 7 months that legal constraints were obstacles he was willing to manage around rather than boundaries he would not cross. She had a police officer who had been professionally thorough and genuinely sorry, and whose thoroughness and sorrow had produced a court date and a warning. She had read enough about post-separation domestic abuse by this point to understand the central operational fact of her situation. The technology Nathan was using to locate her was not sophisticated, it was patient. He was searching her name across platforms. He was using the public-facing information that any American leaves across the ordinary infrastructure of their online presence, professional listings, social media, public records, the digital footprint of a life lived normally in a connected country. The sophistication was not in the method. The sophistication was in the willingness to keep looking until something produced a result. And the result, when it came, told him where she was. And where she was where she was findable. And findable in Melissa's specific situation was the problem. And so on a Thursday evening in October 2017, she opened her laptop and she began to build someone else. Here is how you build a person from nothing when the construction needs to hold. You start with a name. The name must be common enough that it produces no immediate associations and different enough from your own that no search connecting the two names will return results. Claire was her grandmother's middle name. The grandmother who had understood the drawing of the kitchen light when Melissa was 7, the grandmother whose pearl earrings Melissa had worn at her wedding and taken with her in the 2 suitcases in March. Hendricks was the surname of a woman Melissa had worked alongside briefly in 2009 who had since moved to the Pacific Northwest and with whom she had no continuing professional or personal contact, Claire Hendricks. She tested the name in every search engine she could access. The name alone. The name alongside Cincinnati. The name alongside her own, the name alongside her employer, her neighborhood, her address, every concatenation she could construct that might produce a connection. Nothing. She made an email address through a provider she had never used, access through a browser she had downloaded specifically for this purpose onto a device she did not yet have. She spent 3 days researching which prepaid tablet to purchase, which electronics retailer to use, how to pay with cash, which suburb was far enough from her current neighborhood that the purchase would leave no traceable pattern. She bought the tablet on a Saturday from a store 40 minutes from her apartment with cash she had been withdrawing in small amounts for 2 weeks. She made the email address. She made the social media profile. The location she gave Claire was Portland, Oregon. Portland was 3 time zones away. Portland was large enough to absorb a new quiet resident without producing the particular attention that small or medium cities sometimes produce around newcomers. And Melissa had been to Portland once for a photography workshop in 2011 and had taken photographs that weekend that were among the best work she had done in that period, and that she had kept carefully because they were good, and because she had felt something in Portland that she could only describe as the sense that the city understood something about light that other cities she knew did not understand in quite the same way. She gave Claire the Portland photographs. She gave Claire the profession of freelance photographer, because freelance photography requires no institutional affiliation and no employer record and no verification beyond the work itself. She gave Claire a personality that was close enough to her own that maintaining it would require no performance. Thoughtful, quiet, attentive to ordinary beautiful things, interested in books and coffee, and the particular quality of Pacific Northwest winter light on wet streets. She gave Claire a past sufficiently general that it would never require specific detail. Grew up in the Midwest, studied art somewhere, moved west for a change that had become permanent. She gave Claire the fire escape photograph, the best thing Melissa had made. The photograph Nathan had bought at the Short Vine Art Show in October 2008. She gave it to Claire because Claire deserved something true at the center of her, and then she began to live there. Melissa reached out to a domestic violence advocacy organization in Portland in November 2017. Not by phone, not in person. She was still in Cincinnati, still managing the legal proceedings of the divorce, still navigating Nathan's ongoing contact attempts. She reached out through the Claire email address, which she had established specifically as the contact point for any communication that needed to remain untraceable to her real identity. The organization had a digital safety specialist on staff named Diane who had been working with survivors of intimate partner violence on issues of digital safety and protective identity construction for 6 years. Diane had seen many versions of what Melissa was attempting. Most of them, she said later, shared a common weakness. The people building protective online identities tended to construct them as opposites of themselves. Different aesthetic, different personality, different professional background, different interests. The theory was that a completely different person would be harder to connect to the real one. The practice was that a completely different person was extremely difficult to maintain consistently over time because every interaction required performance rather than simple presence. Inconsistency in a digital identity constructed for protective purposes is what makes it visible. An account that changes tone, drops interests, forgets previously mentioned details, responds with different warmth on different days. These are the patterns that a motivated searcher notices. Melissa had not made this mistake. Diane told her in their first exchange that Claire Hendricks was one of the most carefully self-constructed protective identities she had encountered, a survivor building independently before making contact with an advocacy organization. The reason it worked was the reason Melissa had understood instinctively without being able to articulate it. She had not built a different person. She had built herself, minus the information that constituted a locating signal. Diane helped Melissa address the technical vulnerabilities she had not considered. Every digital photograph contains embedded metadata, data written into the image file by the device that captured it, containing information about the device, the settings used, and in many cases the geographic coordinates of the location where the photograph was taken. This metadata is invisible to the casual viewer but accessible to anyone with basic technical knowledge and the motivation to look for it. A photograph posted online under a false name that contains metadata linking it to a specific device or location is a thread that can be followed back to the person posting it. Melissa had been posting her Portland photographs without stripping the metadata. Diane walked her through the process of removing it from every image before posting. She advised on browser behavior, the way that browsing patterns and search histories create identifiable profiles across platforms, even when no account information is entered. She advised on the specific search strategies that intimate partner abusers without technical expertise but with significant persistence typically employ: the monitoring of old usernames and email addresses, the creation of fake accounts to request follows from private profiles, the use of public record searches to track address changes, the monitoring of professional listings and association memberships. Nathan was using several of these strategies. Diane had seen his pattern before. The answer was not to build higher walls. The answer was to give him nothing real on the other side of any wall he could find. Claire Hendricks had no address, no employer listing, no public record, no utility account, no vehicle registration, no court filing, no professional association membership. Claire Hendricks was not findable because Claire Hendricks existed only in the controlled digital space Melissa had built her in, stripped of every data point that could connect the construction back to its architect. By the end of 2017, Claire Hendricks had a coherent digital presence, a photography account with a small number of genuine Portland images from the 2011 workshop supplemented carefully by Creative Commons images selected for their stylistic consistency with Melissa's actual aesthetic, a brief biography, a voice in the comments sections of photography accounts she had chosen to follow for their quality and their distance from any world connected to Nathan. By the end of 2018, Claire had followers who engaged with her work consistently. By the end of 2019, she had a small community of people who found something in her account that they valued and returned to. A woman who worked as a nurse in Seattle who said Claire's photographs made her feel that ordinary things were still worth noticing on the days when the hospital made ordinary things hard to hold on to. A retired teacher in Vermont named Howard, who had discovered photography late in life and who sometimes asked Claire questions about composition and light, that Melissa answered with the full depth of her real knowledge and her real care. A man named Michael who sent a message in the winter of 2019 that said a photograph Melissa had posted of morning light on a wet Portland street had gotten him through a week he could not describe in other terms. He did not explain why the week had been what it had been. He did not need to. Melissa understood the specific quality of a week that requires a photograph of morning light to get through. She had been in several of them. Claire replied with the warmth that was Melissa's actual warmth. The exchange was genuine. The name was not. The divorce was finalized in January 2019. The settlement included a permanent no-contact order. Nathan complied for 4 months. In May 2019, Melissa received a message through a platform account she had not used publicly in nearly 2 years, an account so dormant that she had stopped monitoring it, which was the point of choosing it. She does not know to this day how he found it. She deactivated the account. In August 2019, she found a photograph of the exterior of her apartment building. Her second apartment, the one she had moved to after the photograph of the first one appeared, posted from an account with 3 followers and a profile photograph she did not recognize. The photograph was taken from the street in early morning light. She called her attorney. She filed another police report. She changed apartments for the third time. She moved to a different neighborhood. In February 2020, 18 months after the divorce was finalized, Melissa began the practical process of relocating to Portland for real, not as Claire, as Melissa Jean Hartley, but carrying with her the digital infrastructure that Claire had built and that had been tested across 2.5 years of sustained pressure from a man who had every motivation to find her and had not been able to. She arrived in Portland in June 2020 in the particular quietness of the first pandemic summer, a city that felt emptied out and reconfigured, a season in which new beginnings felt simultaneously more possible and more fragile than usual, as though the world had been taken apart and was waiting to see how it would be reassembled. She found an apartment in the neighborhood she had always imagined Claire living in. She set up her real photography practice under her real name, with a digital presence that was deliberately and precisely minimal. Professional work only, no personal photographs, no location data beyond the city name, no connection to the Cincinnati period of her portfolio, no biographical information beyond the professionally necessary. She continued to maintain Claire, not because the active protective function was still as necessary as it had been in Cincinnati, but because something had happened to Claire over the 2.5 years of her existence that Melissa had not fully anticipated and was not ready to simply end. Claire had followers who had been consistent and warm and present across that period. Claire had said things to people who were having difficult days and had received responses that had mattered to Melissa in ways she had not planned for. The woman nurse in Seattle, Howard in Vermont, Michael and his week that could not be described in other terms. These interactions had been real regardless of the name they had happened under. The warmth Melissa had offered them was her actual warmth. The attention was her actual attention. The eye that had taken the photographs was her actual eye. She could not look at those interactions and decide retroactively that they had been false because the biographical details attached to them were constructed. The construction was the door. What had been offered through the door was real. She began therapy in Portland in the spring of 2021 with a specialist in trauma and identity recovery named Dr. Carolyn Marsh, who had worked with survivors of intimate partner violence for 14 years and who had developed a particular focus in the previous 5 years on the intersection of digital safety and identity reconstruction in post-abuse recovery. In their early sessions, Melissa described Claire Hendricks in clinical terms, a protective measure, a digital safety tool, a necessary construction during a period of active danger that had served its intended function and was now being maintained partly from habit and partly from an attachment she could not fully explain. Dr. Marsh listened carefully across those early sessions and asked precise questions. And then, in their 7th session, she said something that redirected the entire course of Melissa's understanding of what she had built. She said, "Tell me who Claire is, not what Claire was for, who she is." And Melissa described the photography and the warmth and the specific attention to ordinary light and the quality of genuine engagement in every interaction Claire had with her followers. And Dr. Marsh said, "How does that compare to who Melissa was before 2012? And Melissa was quiet for a long time. She was quiet for long enough that Dr. Marsh waited without filling the silence, because Dr. Marsh understood that some silences are doing important work and should not be interrupted. And then Melissa said, "Claire is who Melissa was trying to get back to." Researchers studying identity recovery in survivors of long-term coercive control have documented a phenomenon in which the pre-abuse self, person the survivor was before the abuser, systematically dismantled their sense of who they were and what they were allowed to want, and who they were allowed to become psychologically inaccessible under the sustained weight of that control. The version of the person that existed before the abuse began is not lost, but it becomes, in clinical terms, sequestered, held at a distance that the person can see across but not reach across, unable to be inhabited directly, but still present enough to be recognized when encountered through an indirect route. What Melissa had done, without clinical knowledge, without a therapist's guidance, purely from the survival instinct of a woman who needed to exist somewhere that was safe enough to think clearly, was construct an indirect route back to her pre-abuse self. The photographer who noticed light on ordinary things. The woman who responded with genuine warmth to strangers having difficult weeks. The person who engaged with the world without calculating the cost of the engagement first, because Nathan's coercive control had turned every engagement into a calculation, and the calculation had over 5 years become the loudest sound in Melissa's internal life. Claire existed in a space where Nathan could not reach, and in that space Melissa had been, without fully understanding what she was doing, practicing being herself, not performing herself, practicing. The way you practice a musical instrument that you have not played in years, not to perform it for anyone yet, just to find out if the skill is still there, to discover that it is still there, to restore your own trust in the fact that you still know how to do this thing that is most essentially you. Dr. Marsh called this identity reclamation through projected self-construction. She said she had not encountered the specific phenomenon in quite this form before, the particular intersection of digital safety technology and unconscious identity preservation in a post-abuse context, but that the psychological mechanism it described was entirely consistent with what the trauma literature documented about the indirect routes through which survivors of sustained coercive control sometimes reconstruct aspects of themselves that direct reconstruction is not yet able to access. She told Melissa that the construction of Claire Hendricks was among the most sophisticated acts of psychological self-preservation she had encountered in 14 years of working with survivors. Not the deception. Dr. Marsh was careful and precise about this distinction. The deception had been necessary, and it had served its function, and Melissa neither needed nor deserved to be proud of a necessary tool. What she deserved to recognize was the instinct that had known what to build, the instinct that had chosen the fire escape photograph, the best thing Melissa had ever made, the thing Nathan had chosen at the art show in 2008, the image that had started everything, as the image at the center of a constructed identity built for survival. The instinct that had given Claire exactly and specifically the qualities that 5 years of coercive control had most systematically told Melissa she was not allowed to be. The warmth, the attention, the honest engagement with light on ordinary things. That instinct was not deception. That was the part of Melissa that Nathan had not been able to reach. That was the part that knew what it was and knew how to protect itself, even when the person it was protecting did not yet have the language or the safety to say so out loud. Nathan was arrested in April 2021 on charges relating to the violation of the permanent no-contact order and digital harassment across multiple platforms across a period of nearly 4 years. The prosecution built a case across 14 months using documentation that Melissa and her attorney had been assembling since March 2017, every email, every police report, every platform account, every violation logged with date and content, and the account information that connected it to Nathan. He was convicted in July 2022. The sentence was 18 months of supervised release, with conditions that included the permanent no-contact order and mandatory participation in a certified domestic violence intervention program. More than 50% of women murdered in the United States are killed by an intimate partner. Only about 1 in 4 physical assaults by an intimate partner are ever reported to police. Only a fraction of reported cases result in conviction. Nathan's conviction placed him in a statistical category so small that Melissa's attorney, who had been working in domestic violence law for 11 years, told her it was among the most fully documented and successfully prosecuted post-separation harassment cases he had seen in his practice. Melissa did not attend the conviction hearing. She was in Portland on a Tuesday afternoon editing photographs from a commission she was proud of. Documentary work for a nonprofit that served homeless families in the Pacific Northwest, images of ordinary interior spaces and the lives being lived inside them. Her attorney sent her the outcome by text message. She put her phone face down on the desk beside the hard drive she was working from. She looked at the photographs on the screen for a long time. The light in them was very good. She closed the Claire Hendricks account in March 2023. She had been thinking about closing it for the better part of a year, not because it had become burdensome, but because the work she and Dr. Marsh had been doing in therapy had brought her to a place where the distinction between Claire and Melissa had begun to feel less like a distance she needed and more like a habit she had been carrying past its usefulness. She was ready to be one person in one city under one name without the maintenance that the second presence required. She posted a final photograph on a Tuesday morning, the fire escape in morning light, the Cincinnati fire escape from 2007. The image Nathan had bought and that she had taken back during the divorce proceedings, and that had hung in her Portland apartment for 3 years as the first thing she looked at in the morning. The caption said simply, "Thank you for being here." Within 24 hours, 47 people had responded. not in the detached way of online commentary, but in the specific way of people who had been given something they genuinely valued and who understood, at least partially, what it meant to no longer have access to it. A woman who said she had looked at Claire's photographs every morning for 3 years without ever quite being able to say why they helped, but knowing with certainty that they did. Howard in Vermont, who said he would not have continued pursuing photography without the patience of Claire's responses to his questions in 2018 and 2019. Michael, who had sent the message about the week that could not be described, who said simply, "I hope wherever you go next has good light." Melissa read every response. She cried over several of them. And the thing she was crying for took her another 2 sessions with Dr. Marsh to name accurately. She was not crying from guilt. She was not crying from relief. She was crying for Claire, for the constructed person who had become real enough in the experience of 412 people to be genuinely missed, for the version of herself that had to be built in secret in order to survive, for the instinct that had known to build it, and for the distance between who she had been when she built it, alone in a Cincinnati apartment on a Thursday night, with a restraining order that had been violated twice in a laptop, and the knowledge that she had to do something that the system she had trusted to protect her was not doing, and who she was now, 40 years old, in Portland, under her real name, doing the work she had always meant to do, still looking at the fire escape photograph every morning, still understanding the difference between the thing and the light on the thing. Melissa Jean Hartley is 41 years old in 2026. She lives in Portland, Oregon. She runs a photography practice with a reputation in the Pacific Northwest for documentary work that her graduate assessment committee would have recognized immediately, work about the truth inside ordinary things. She is in a relationship with a man named David who knows the full account of everything and who asks questions about her photographs that demonstrate he has actually looked at them. She is in therapy every 2 weeks with Dr. Marsh. She calls Laura every Sunday. She sees Rachel twice a year in person and more than that by phone. She has spoken at 2 public events about digital safety and domestic abuse situations, once to an advocacy organization in Portland in 2023 and once at a conference Dr. Marsh organized in 2024. At both events, she spoke under a name that was not her real name. Not because she is still afraid of Nathan, but because the women in the audience who most needed to hear what she had to say needed to believe that the person saying it understood from the inside, from the specific Thursday night on the other side of the violation that the system had documented and not prevented, that sometimes your real name is the most dangerous thing about you. And that understanding, sometimes the most honest thing you can do, is to stop using it until the danger has passed. Melissa understood that more completely than anyone else in either room. What does Melissa's story tell us about the country that made it necessary? It tells us that about 4 in 10 American women have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. It tells us that more than 50% of women murdered in the United States are killed by a current or former intimate partner. It tells us that about half of those murders occur as or after a woman tries to leave. It tells us that in 2025, an estimated 70% of domestic violence survivors reported being monitored through phones, GPS tracking, or social media accounts. It tells us that the legal system's response to restraining order violations is measured in weeks and court dates and formal warnings, while the danger to the person the order was issued to protect is measured in real time and early morning photographs of the exterior of buildings she believed she had moved to safely. Melissa did not build Claire Hendricks because the system failed her once. She built Claire Hendricks because the system had failed her enough times in specific and documentable ways that she had arrived at a clear understanding of what she had to do that the system was not going to do for her. She had to become unfindable. And she found the only way available to her to do it. The fire escape photograph hangs in her Portland apartment now. She took it back from Nathan's house in the divorce settlement, specifically deliberately, because it was hers, and because what had been done with it in the years since he had bought it in 2008 had made it into something more than a very good photograph. It was the image she had chosen to place at the center of the person she had built to survive. The person who had turned out, through 6 years of quiet construction and maintenance, and the particular courage of showing up as yourself in a space too small to be found by the person trying to find you, to be herself. The person who had been there the whole time, waiting to be built back into someone who could stand in the light without first calculating what the light was going to cost her. There is a question at the center of this story that the law cannot answer, and that philosophy can only approach. and that only the people who have actually lived inside the specific terror of being findable to someone who has demonstrated what they do when they find you can answer from the inside. The question is not whether what Melissa did was deception. It was deception. The name was false. The biography was constructed. The history Claire Hendricks was given was not Melissa's history. Those are facts, and they are not complicated facts. The question is what the deception contained. The warmth that made Michael feel seen during a week he could not describe in other terms. The patience that gave Howard in Vermont the confidence to keep pursuing something he loved in the last years of his life. The eye that looked at light on ordinary things and found the truth inside them, and shared it with 412 people across 6 years. That was not Claire's, that was Melissa's. All of it, every photograph, every response, every conversation that mattered to the person who received it. The only thing that was ever false was the name on the door. And the name on the door was false because the name on the door needed to be false. Because the real name was being searched for. And the person doing the searching had already proven, twice, in documented and reported and professionally processed incidents that produced court, dates and formal warnings, what he intended to do when the search returned a result. We want to ask you something before we go, and we want you to actually sit with it before you decide you already know the answer. Knowing everything you now know about Melissa, knowing the restraining order and the 2 violations and the photographs of her apartment buildings from the street in early morning light and the emails at 2 in the morning and the fake accounts and the 4 years of documented harassment across the post-separation period, knowing about the fire escape photograph and Claire and the 412 followers and Michael and the nurse in Seattle and the warmth that was always Melissa's actual warmth, regardless of the name it was offered under. Knowing that about half of intimate partner murders in this country occur as or after a woman tries to leave. Knowing that Melissa is 41 years old in Portland, Oregon, and that Nathan was convicted and that the fire escape photograph hangs in her apartment as the first thing she looks at in the morning. Knowing all of that, is there a single thing she did that you would judge? Leave your answer in the comments below. We read everyone. And if this story found something in you, something about survival and what it requires, and the difference between deception and the only option remaining, tell us what it found. This is what this channel exists for. And next week on the Dopamine arc, the story of a father who took the stand in a federal courtroom and testified against his own son. The psychology of loyalty when loyalty and conscience are pointing in opposite directions. The specific cost of telling the truth when the truth belongs to someone you love more than almost anything else. You will not be comfortable at the end of it, we promise you that. This is the Dopamine arc. Stay curious, stay human.